recently got accepted in PRB. And before I describe our work, I'll give you descriptions of what I mean by these terms. And before I start, I request you to interrupt me at any time when things are unclear. So, okay. So first I'll talk to you about what is Anderson localization. So consider a lattice, and at each side, let's say there is a uniform background potential is there, and the particle can hop to its nearest neighbors. So if you compute the eigenstates of that system, you'll find that the eigenstates are extended. And on the other hand, if you induce some randomness in the system in terms of this parameter W, which is called the disorder strength, you'll see that the wave functions will instantly localize. And in 1 and 2 dimensions, which are also called lower dimensions, any finite disorder you put in the system, your system will get localized. Now, so therefore, one needs to go to the higher dimensions to look at the transition. So we will do that, and that brings us to what is called random graphs. So to form a random graph, you take a bunch of sites and connect them randomly, and you form the random graph. But now if you want to force a constraint that at each site you want to keep the connectivity same, so that brings you to the random regular graph. This regular means the connectivity at each site is same. And here I show a random regular graph with some connectivity k equals to 3. And the properties of these kind of systems are, they are locally tree-like. As you can see here, if you take a local portion of the system and try to see how it looks like locally tree-like. And on the other hand, if you want to look at the number of sites at some distance r from a given site, you'll see that they grow exponentially with the distance. And these kind of systems are also sometimes referred to as effectively infinite dimensional systems, and therefore these systems are prototypical systems to study Anderson localization. And also I should mention here that the kind of system that has been studied in this context are the tight binding model with nearest neighbor connections, meaning that the particle can only hop if there is a link between that site and the site it hops to. So now, also interestingly, if you look at the many body interacting problem and you write the problem in the respective Fock space basis, the structure of the Fock space has this kind of nature, which also is a random graph in some sense, but things are slightly different, but there are similarities as well. So keeping this in mind as well, we'll try to only focus on these higher dimensional systems as a toy model to understand this many body interacting problem in these random graphs. So I'll now move on to the question that we asked. So we asked that if we now induce if we induce long range hoppings in the system, will this destabilize the localized behavior of the system? So to understand this more properly, I'll come here. So now here I define what is called the spatially structured RRGs. So if you ignore these arcs here, so what is remaining is the skeleton of the RRG. And here we have, so if you take this side, these arcs represent the long range hoppings. So these are hoppings which are further than these nearest neighbors. So if you want to write this mathematically, you'll write a single particle hopping problem where this hopping term will be dependent on the distance, and we take the distance to be decaying as an exponential, which I'll come to why. And of course, for this Anderson problem, you'll need a background disorder, which we take to be a randomly normally distributed number with standard deviation W, which is called the disorder strength. So naturally, so if you take the limit xi going to 0, you'll see that this model reduces to the nearest neighbor model, and therefore we extend the idea to long range systems in this context. And of course, this W will, if you increase W, you'll see that it will try to localize the system. On the other hand, if you increase this xi, which induces the long range hoppings, this will try to delocalize the system. So naturally, there will be a competition between these two scales that will give us the transition. Right. So, of course, we know that in these random graph systems, the number of sites grows exponentially with the distance. That means you'll at least require the hopping to decay exponentially. Any slower than that will trivially delocalize your system. So you won't have any localized phase in the system. Now, another interesting thing is that this model is an infinite dimensional generalization of the power law banded random matrix models that are studied in the context of finite dimensions. So to see this, if you look at the scaling of the hopping amplitude, in both the cases they are identical. So in that sense they are similar. And interestingly, our construction interpolates between the short range Anderson models, which is the limit of xi going to 0, and on the other hand, these long range all to all connected models, which means that all the sites are sort of having same amplitude, meaning all to all connected. And if you tune xi here, we can go from one region to other region. So yeah, so this was about the properties of the model. Now we will try to see what extra nature that we have in the system. So we'll first look at the phase diagram. So to get the phase diagram, we exactly diagonalize our system and also use a self-consistent field theory at the mean field level, which I'll come to. So if you now look at this phase diagram, so this color map that you see here is obtained from the statistics of the eigenstates, and on the other hand, these red points that you see are the critical points obtained from the eigenvalue statistics. And this green line here is an analytical result obtained from a self-consistent mean field theory. And these two lines that you see here, will treat them as references to understand these phase diagram better in the subsequent slides. Now, so we find that there are no intervening multifractal phase in the system. So usually in the many-body interacting problems or on these kind of problems on the random graphs, people have observed these multifractal phases. But in this case, we don't have this. But we'll try to understand why it is not there later. And also, one interesting fact about our model is that after the critical xi, there will be no existence of any localized phase. To see this, if you compare the norms of the terms in the Hamiltonian, you'll see the kinetic term and the potential term has this kind of scaling initially, and if your xi goes above this value, this kinetic term starts scaling with n square. So that means this n square and n now cannot actually compete, right? N square completely overwhelms the potential term, which means that you have a delocalization instantly in the system, right? So now we'll try to understand this phase diagram and the properties of it. So to start with, I'll come to a very standard quantity that one uses to distinguish between these phases. So this is called level spacing ratio. So you see here, this value corresponds to the delocalized state, and this is the localized side. And this quantity can only distinguish between the ergodic and the non-ergodic behavior, the phase. So, but to understand the behavior, the exact nature of the non-ergodic states, you have to go to the eigenstates. So I don't have much time, so I'll maybe rush. So now, one of the quantities to look at is the moment of the eigenstates, and of particular interest is the q equals to 2 moment, which measures the fraction of sites where the eigenstate is mostly confined. So I flash the phase diagram here as well to show you that the color map that you saw here is of this tau2, which is the multifractal exponent, and in the thermodynamic limit you'll expect it to be 1 in the delocalized states, and in the localized states it should be 0, and it should be something in between for the multifractal states, right? So I'll not go into this. So this basically gives you the evidence of why there is no multifractal phase in the system, so which I'll not go into. So I'll directly go into the critical scaling properties. So the interesting part here is that if you have finite dimensional systems, there you only have one scaling behavior, but in this random graph kind of systems, these two functions have different scalings. And this thing in finite dimensions has same scaling, so that's why there is only one scale there. Here you have two. So now if you look at the critical properties, the main upshot of this plot is that there is a Kostelis-Thouless like behavior at the transition, and there is a two-parameter scaling, which is also in line with other studies in the MBL context and also in the other random graph models in the Anderson localization studies. Okay, so now I'll move on to the last part, which is understanding the localization behavior through the self-consistent theory. So to start with, one writes the local Green's function at some site X, and from there one derives the expression of the self-energy at that site using something called a renormalized perturbation expansion, and that brings you to these two n number of equations, and this R is the real part of the self energy and delta is the imaginary part of the self energy. And before I talk about these two equations, it's important to note that this delta x is related to the rate of loss of probability at some site x. So we can treat this as our order parameter, and this can give us insights into the transition. So there are 2n number of equations here for a given system of size n. So you have to solve these 2n coupled equations to get statistics of these two quantities. Because there are random numbers in the equations, you will have distribution of these things. But now these kind of quantities are heavy-tailed in these things, so you can't take the mean values as your order parameter. So you have to look at something which does not take into account this tails. So the typical value is the one which does not take into account this quantity. So this typical value in the delocalized phase, we expect it to be finite, which will mean so that it will not scale with the system size, because we only have finite number of system size that we can do numerically, and in the localized phase we'll expect it to vanish with increasing system size. So now you can look at the phase diagram in terms of this alpha. So if you plot this, you have these two phases here, and these 4 points are actually showing you the slope, which is this alpha here. And so if you do a self-consistent mean field theory, you will see that you obtain this line, which is also not very bad. And this actually concludes my talk. And so maybe I'll take some questions, and maybe I can discuss this later if someone wants. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So 2 questions. First, why are random graphs effectively infinite dimensional?
Yeah, so if you look at the number of sites at some distance r, they grow exponentially. It is in that sense people call them effectively infinite dimension. So if you look at finite dimensions, they don't grow exponentially. They grow some polynomial, r to the power something. So it is in that sense they actually.
Right. And secondly, you made a connection between many body problem and these random graphs. So
Right.
do you go back to that?
Yeah, actually, so if you look at the Fox space graph, so Fox space graph is also a kind of random regular graph which connect with the connectivity equal to your system size. So on the other hand, but the distinction between these two is that in random regular graphs, the size of the loops that you have can be large. But in these kind of many body problems, the loop size can be very small as well. So you just flip one spin and then come back to there. So the smallest loop size can be very small. On the other hand, for random graphs, you don't have that small size. So there are, of course, differences and similarities. Similarities in the sense I showed you the critical property where they show similar behavior. On the other hand, if you look at the Fox space graph, the background disorder that you will have here will be correlated. On the other hand, in the random graph, you don't consider them to be correlated. Yeah.
Okay.
Next question. Okay, if there is no question, let's thank Bibek.
Thank you.